Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. Today, we are going to cover oil and gas topics on this podcast. We've covered oil and gas quite a bit, and that's important to our state because Wyoming is a top oil and gas producing state. We're usually in the top 10 in both oil production and gas production. Quite a bit of our oil production in Wyoming is from the process of enhanced oil recovery. And today we have an expert on enhanced oil recovery and oil production techniques. It's Dr. Reza Barati. He has spent a lot of time in Wyoming, has been at the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute previously. Today, he is the Don W. Green Professor of Petroleum Engineering and the Director of the Tertiary Oil Recovery Program at the University of Kansas. So not too far away. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Barati. Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you talk about your time in Wyoming and how you got to your current role?
Yeah, I actually came to Wyoming immediately after I graduated with my PhD at the University of Kansas. Before that, when I did my master's, I spent a couple of years in Houston with Schlumberger. Did my PhD, came here and worked at the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute on a variety of projects. One of the main ones was on the Minnelusa Formation in the Powder River Basin. So I was driving a lot to Gillette. Mm-hmm. We did a core project. We managed the core project that we took. And I remember the companies involved were Merit and True at the time. And we did work on multiple projects related to simulation and enhanced oil recovery in that formation.
So you're saying the Minnelusa Formation?
Yep.
Okay, in the Powder River Basin?
Yep.
Okay.
We did some investigation also at the time. This was my main focus was on the Minnelusa Formation at the time. Mm-hmm. But we did also some investigations, a smaller, I was involved in other projects related to Niobrara, the ROZ, TOZ, the transition
Okay,
zones.
Explain what that means for everyone.
Those are the residual oil zones and the transition zones between the oil and water zone.
So that's ROZ and TZ.
TOZ.
Oh, TOZ, okay.
And they are typically a transition between the water and oil window. However, the saturation of the oil is enough to inject CO2 and extract the oil. And we do, as far as I know, we do have plenty of that in Wyoming.
Yeah.
And then we also did a project on Tennessee Leap in terms of conformance control in Tennessee Leap and a chemical flooding project in the Minnelusa Formation.
Okay, so most of our listeners have heard of these different techniques, but at a really high level, let's walk through these different steps. So you have primary recovery, and what you're talking about is after your initial primary recovery, then you can take different approaches using the same wells, same oil formation, or the same reservoir to continue producing.
Typically, when we start producing from a reservoir, initially the production comes from the initial energy of the reservoir, which could be the solution gas drive, it could be the water drive, it could be any of the initial sources of energy there. If it is the solution gas drive, or if the water source that is supporting is limited, the pressure drops with time. Now we have to go through pressurization processes, and water flooding is one. Gas injection for secondary recovery is one. The methods that we do use, such as injecting water to push the oil from one well to another and increasing the pressure of the reservoir back up, but it doesn't really wash out the water. Those are called the secondary methods. The tertiary methods are the methods where you really go hard and you really want to clean the rock. You use CO2, for example, in supercritical state. You use surfactants or anything else that could, or some people have tried nanoparticles, certain type of nanoparticles, to be able to produce what we call residual oil. And that is really the tertiary phase. The enhanced oil recovery, however, starts from the secondary phase. That's any method that can enhance the oil production by modifying the water flooding, by injecting polymer gel to direct water into the other zones that have not been pushed. The oil has not been pushed out of them. And it comes all the way to the tertiary phase.
So there's primary, secondary, and tertiary, and you're talking about all these different techniques, especially for secondary and tertiary recovery. I know it's different for everything, but is there like, just to help our listeners understand, is there like kind of general guidelines of how much oil remains in the rock after each one of those phases? Like after primary recovery, how much oil is left?
So we have different rock types. That is a function of what the rock is made of. For example, we do have in conventional classes of reservoirs, we have sandstones, limestones, dolomites, or a mixture of all of that with some clay or no clay, depending on the system. Depending on the type of the rock, you could have residual oils of anything from 10 to 30 or 40%. That is for conventional rocks. For unconventional rocks, and maybe we should define that class after this question, but for unconventional rocks, the residual oil could be a lot higher because the pores are a lot smaller. So if I want to make it clear for your audience, a rock looks like a sponge. And
at a very small scale.
At a very small scale.
Yeah.
And that the sponge is also under a lot of stress and pressure because it's under the ground. Now, those pores, the little volumes inside the sponge, they are the ones who are controlling how the oil is going to go from point A to point B. And those pores, which we call them pores, they have bodies and they have throats. And those throats are controlling the flow typically. Now, the residual oil in shale is mainly high, or in unconventional is mainly high, because those pores are a lot smaller. So if you want to go on a scale, in conventional rocks, and again, conventional rocks are what we used to produce a lot from, and that was the easier oil to produce from. And that was the oil that was generated in the resource rocks and migrated into the reservoir rocks. And historically, we have been producing from those up until around 2000s when we started to go and produce from the source rocks where the oil was actually initially formed. And those are the typical shale oils that we are producing from. Now, the source rocks, the problem with them is that the permeability and the size of the pores is significantly smaller. And we are talking, as a simple comparison, in conventionals, a pore size could be between 20 to 100 micron. In unconventionals, it could be anything from 2 to 300 nanometer. So that's the difference.
So order of magnitude.
That's the difference in the scale. And that is why we're going to have a lot more residual oil in those reservoirs, and it's harder to produce oil as much as we do in conventionals. Gas is easier to produce from those rocks because the gas molecules are smaller. So that's kind of that's kind of a range for the residual oil. In unconventionals, we could have significantly high residual oils of 50, 60% sometimes.
So then most of our secondary and tertiary recovery in Wyoming is for which type of conventional or unconventional?
So far, in most of the country, especially in Wyoming, as far as I know, the secondary and tertiary has been... Secondary, if you think water flood, does not have a room for shales.
Right.
We don't
right. Good point.
Shales.
Yeah.
So in shales, we call it improved oil recovery.
Okay.
We simply go from primary to improved oil recovery, and that has been mainly gas. Now, in Wyoming, most of the current EOR projects, as far as I know, are in the conventional domain.
Right.
So that's what we have historically done. We know how to do it. The CO2 floods that you guys have, the chemical floods that, especially in 80s, there was a lot of polymer floods when there was some, discount or something on the polymer by the government or some incentives by the government on polymers. So we do have actually a good library of polymer floods, for example, from that time on reservoirs here in Wyoming. There are so many chemical flood examples in Wyoming, and definitely some of the best CO2 flood examples are from here too.
We actually could use, even today, we could use more CO2 than we have now for enhanced oil recovery. So
Wyoming is blessed with all sorts of energy and also new ventures. Even if you're in oil and gas, Wyoming is a good place to be, but also if you're in the new ventures, CO2, hydrogen, all of that, Wyoming is still the critical minerals. Wyoming is still the best place to be, probably.
Nuclear, just keep going. You're giving my talk.
Yeah, coal.
Yep, it's the best. That's why we're here. So, and you are part of this whole ecosystem in Wyoming. You worked at the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. Today, that's part of the School of Energy Resources. Yep. Of course, it existed before the school existed. Is there any projects you haven't mentioned that you worked on while you were at EORI that you really enjoyed?
I enjoyed everything I did at the time.
Good answer.
We had a good team. Yeah. But the core characterization project was a project on Menalusa that we were working on. And my task was to work with multiple faculty in different departments because they had different capabilities for measurement. Mm-hmm. And I think we did a good job as a team on that project of characterizing the Menalusa formation. At that time, there were certain data that were totally missing. We did not have any basic data, and you need those data to understand flow.
Like what kind of information was missing?
Like relative permeability on different rock types, capillary pressure, just fundamental, basic characterization of the rock. And we did, I think one of the goals of that project was to basically come up with a library for these type of measurements where we could use it for our chemical flood, our water flood, our other projects. And there was also a simulation project on Menalusa formation that we did, I think, for True Oil at the time. And I personally enjoyed the interactions with True and this team and enjoyed the whole project and the outcome of it because we learned a lot about, what to do and what not to do and all of that. And it was a good learning process for me as well.
I think that's a great point. We get so much value from our interaction with industry partners, which is another kind of, I like to say, a superpower of Wyoming because we're closer to industry. We can really have real-time feedback. So just got off a call like that right before recording this very podcast. So, and it's interesting in terms of the other great thing about being in Wyoming is that you can have impact. And I'm sure you've continue to follow this, that foundational work on the Menalusa is still being used today. There's still a Menalusa working group, and it's not just related to Menalusa, but EORI is trying to look, they quantified the return on investment to the state. So in their 20 years of existence, they have calculated that the projects they worked on have netted the state over $400 million in net revenue. So what that means is that foundational work ends up leading to real projects someday. And there's still a Menalusa consortia. Yep.
Yeah, we
still
were a member
moving.
Of that, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I really enjoyed during my time here and right now at the Tertiary Oil Recovery Program working with the industry. I try to stay close to the industry and understand their challenges on day-to-day basis. And I personally still learn from those interactions as well.
Yeah. So going back to CO2 flooding specifically, yep. Can you just talk about how that works? How does that allow more oil to be released from a formation?
Yeah, CO2 at the supercritical phase, it is supercritical, which one property of CO2 that we like.
Wait, what does supercritical mean?
So any components, for example, CO2, nitrogen, or hydrogen, they can show up in different phases, correct? They could come in liquid, they could come in gas phase, they could come in what we call the supercritical phase, which is kind of a condensed gas, which looks like a liquid, but it's not liquid.
It has both liquid and gas properties.
Yes. And then these happen at different pressures and temperatures. And with CO2, what we really like is that supercriticality happens at low pressures and low temperatures. And that helps because then it works as a solvent. It just kind of cleans up your rock for you. And the way it works is that we typically inject it. And in a typical process, you typically do this after the water flood. However, there have been cases that people have started earlier and they just wanted to do it. And what it does, not only it keeps extracting the components of the hydrocarbon from the rock as it goes. It's like a sweep process. It goes from 1 point to point 2, and it kind of sweeps the oil. At the same time, it extracts components of the oil from the rock, and it cleans up the rock and goes and produces them at the production. One challenge with that could be that because of the difference in the viscosity and density, it could preferentially take the higher permeability channels or zones. As a result, a lot of the time, like the Weber formation, that was Tennessee Sleep formation, the Weber project. They did in Wyoming, they did WAGs or conformance processes. That means that you have to go either using gel or high concentration polymer, shut those high permeability zones so that CO2 can sweep through smaller permeabilities. Or we do alternates of water and CO2, which we call it water alternating gas. And that way we keep diverting CO2 into the tighter zones and producing more oil. And again, there have been very successful CO2 projects here in the U.S. in general. I had the pleasure of one summer when I was a faculty visiting Kinder Morgan and working on the SACROC project with them, which is one of the successful cases of, in my opinion, SACROC is a school for CO2 flooding because they had conformance issues, they had wax issues. One typical problem is that if you have paraffin issues during the CO2 injection, you see more of that at your producers. And now how to deal with that is a challenge. How to develop your reservoir as you get into it, because Mother Nature gives you a certain geology that you have to deal with, and how to design your injections, how to design your water curtains around that injection pattern so you don't lose the gas or the supercritical phase is important. So there's a lot that goes to a project like that, but generally the foundation of that is based on sweep process and extraction of the oil from the rock surface.
And so what different areas are you looking at in your current role?
Well, in my current role, our main interest is EOR and tertiary processes that we are looking into. We are still serving the oil and gas industry. But as we are going through the new era of energy, we are also adapting by looking into anything else that is for which we have the capabilities and expertise. So I've been very much involved in multiple CCUS projects recently, because traditionally with these CO2 projects, the source of the CO2 was natural CO2, which we would get from under the ground from the reservoirs.
Wait, I don't think everyone realizes that is actually the source of a lot of CO2 today. So let's talk about that for a second, because there's a lot of enhanced oil recovery across the nation, obviously big in Wyoming. Say what you just said again. Where is that CO2 coming from for the most part?
These are from natural resources. These are from
natural resources.
Subsurface resources.
And I think that's like a key point, is that, for people who aren't geologists or not experienced with the subsurface, to understand that storing CO2 for geological timescales for millions and millions of years is something the Earth already does.
Yep.
So there's actually confidence that it can continue happening, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the structure of the reservoirs that generate CO2 are probably, sometimes they're different a little bit than what we are targeting sometimes. But in general, the answer is yes to that. But you're correct. We don't have a lot of, even though we are working on capturing CO2 from different sources of emission and all of that, we still have not generated enough to replace a lot of that natural CO2.
Yeah.
And CO2 is, in my opinion, turning into a commodity.
Yeah.
And it's not just oil and gas that is using it. We are also using it for other industries, for chemical, for food, for other industries.
Sure.
And that's a resource. And how to capture it these days is a big deal. And as the energy industry is going towards more capture from the emission sources, and we start from lower hanging fruits, which is clean CO2 coming from an ethanol plant, all the way to power plants and all the way to refineries, etc. The more we capture, if we assume the demand is going to stay the same, we can replace some of that natural CO2. But the predictions are telling us that the demand is going to go up. So as a result, there will be a still usage for that CO2 as well. And the whole population around the world can still use it as a resource for different industries.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like I said, we're actually a little short on CO2.
Yes.
There's oil fields that could probably be producing more if we had more. Yep. So, okay, thanks for explaining that. So let's talk about a specific technology called Huff and Puff. First, let's just start with the basics. What does that mean?
Huff and Puff is a process where, so we mentioned enhanced oil recovery processes and tertiary processes. All of those are based in conventional rocks, where the pore sizes are bigger and the permeability is higher. The foundation of that was based on injection production techniques, meaning that you inject into a well and you produce from multiple wells around it as a pattern. So the reason for that was conventional rocks, they had enough connectivity and permeability that the fluid or the gas could make it from point A to point B. In shale resources, typically, when we get into them, we don't have a reservoir that Mother Nature has given us. We generate our own reservoir. And the way we generate it, because these are tight rocks, these are nanodarcy rocks. So we cannot really inject from point A to point B into these rocks. It's impossible. What we do is we get into them and we develop our own reservoir, which we call that a stimulated reservoir volume. That is the zone that we frack. That's why hydraulic fracturing was such an important technique for these reservoirs to develop. Because without that, you couldn't generate your own reservoir.
I think it's funny, that's the wording you're using. We're generating our own reservoir. Like the oil is there, but there's just no way you can't get it out because there's no connectivity.
Yes.
Okay, keep going.
Now, if you keep that, that's a very key concept, and that's how I teach it to my students in my class. That's a very key concept to understand these shale rocks, because now if you think about it that way, now you understand why we do everything else. So first we understand why fracturing is important, because that fracturing, and why complex fracturing is important, because it's all about surface area. The production from these rocks is all about the surface area that you're generating. So the more complex your fracture is, the larger is your surface area, the higher is your production, and your depletion process is better. Now, if you think about that, we cannot do the EOR processes the way we did in the conventional rocks anymore. We cannot inject from one well to another well through the matrix. There are exceptions, which we can talk about later on, but generally, if we talk about it. Now, people came up, companies in Texas mainly started this process, and that was like, this is a known process, by the way, since 1970s. Initially, they were doing this in other reservoirs, such as heavy oil and all of that, for different purpose, because the viscosity was high there. But then EOG, for example, the company in Texas, they started to use this for Eagle Ford shale big time. And they have these compressors that move from pattern to pattern, injecting gas at high pressure. Because you cannot go from an injector to a producer in these rocks because of lack of connectivity, you only inject into the reservoir that you generated, and then you produce it back. And
out of the same well.
Right,
you inject and then produce out of the same well.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's what we call huff and puff, basically. And that gas could be CO2, could be produced gas. So far, produced gas has been the most popular one. There are so many reasons for it.
Say what you mean by produced gas.
That's just the gas that you produce and you quickly process and you return it back to the cycle.
It just comes out with the oil.
Yes.
And then you reuse it. Okay.
And that has been so far, it's mainly methane, 60-70% methane, and then some other stuff. And then that has been so far the most popular component for injection for huff and puff, which is also what most of the companies in Texas did in Eagle Ford, and some companies in the Bakken did it. There's new interest in Niobrara. I think University of Wyoming is starting a big project on that.
And there have been examples of huff and puff technology being applied in Wyoming. I'm curious, from your perspective, obviously an expert in the field, do you think there's opportunities to apply this like more broadly in Wyoming and to unconventional resources, and why?
I think there's the opportunity there. Every play is a new play, and they have their own challenges. In Wyoming, we have the Niobrara as a non-conventional resource, and Niobrara is heavily naturally fractured and communication with other zones and water. Those are the major problems typically in Niobrara, as far as I understand it. That makes definitely EOR and huff and puff is possible, but that's why projects like the one that the state is funding is probably necessary to investigate and see what methods should we use here in terms of injection and production. Because, for example, when you are developing a pattern for injection, production, and huff and puff, you typically, it's not just the well that is injecting and producing. No matter which reservoir you are, you will lose some of that gas. Because you have some of your fractures that you generate, they shoot off and they go to different directions, correct? So you lose some of that. So you have to also have wells around you that are capturing that gas. Now, that design may be different in Niobrara versus Eagle Ford versus Permian Basin. And so having that experimental well and a pilot is very important for these processes. And I think Niobrara is, of course, the obvious candidate, because most of the wells have been producing for such a long time. They have been depleted. It's time to pressurize them again and produce more oil. But how to do it in Niobrara could be different than how to do it in Eagle Ford.
And you're talking about Niobrara, but actually we also, can we talk about the Mowry?
Yes.
So Mowry is a source rock,
Yep.
for which obviously you've already said, is unconventional.
Yep.
And we have a big project creatively called the Mowry Project here at the University of Wyoming, where thanks to funding from the state and initial funding from the Wyoming Energy Authority, we're able to look at all different aspects of working on the Mowry. For example, drilling fluids, all kinds of stuff, fracking fluids, fracking components, artificial intelligence for finding the sweet spots, the economics, it just goes on and on. So production profiles look different in the Mowry than most other unconventional production. So let's start just from your perspective, explain how that's different. Why do the profiles look different?
Yeah. So again, I'm just starting to learn more about Mowry Shale. My understanding, and we have seen this in other places too, that the decline curves are different. And the decline curve is how the production curve declines during the years of production. That could be a function of so many things. So as we discussed again, we develop our own reservoir and we generate our own surface area. Now, when we do these frac jobs, we inject fluid at high pressure with certain sand and proppants to keep those fractures open.
So by fracture, it's
a crack.
Cracking the rock.
Yep, we are cracking.
And that's how we are creating the reservoir.
Exactly.
From your words. Okay.
Yep. And then we want to have a complex network of fractures. So we want to generate more surface area. That's why we are using what we call a slick water. And sometimes we would like to have a complex network connected to a planar type of a fracture. That's why we use hybrid jobs, which is slick water, which is just close to water with a little bit of polymer, followed by crosslink fracture, which is like something between a fluid and a solid. It's a gel. And that can generate a planar fracture, a big planar fracture that is connected to a network of microfractures and smaller fractures. Now we have to, because Mother Nature applies a stress, those fractures, as soon as we stop injecting the frac fluids, they close back.
Yeah.
Now we need to keep them open. That's why we inject the proppants. Now, how those fractures stay open is a function of what that rock is made of. Now, certain materials could be more brittle. Certain materials could be closing faster under stress. You may have certain embedment, meaning that the proppant may just get embedded into the rock under stress, so the fracture doesn't really stay open. All of these are things that as we are speaking, we are trying to understand on Mowry Shale because there has been less application into that. But
and one pause, a less fancy word for proppant is sand.
Well, the simple proppant is sand. Yeah, but different sands can take different types of stress.
Yeah.
But the industry has reached a conclusion that for shales, we really don't need fancy proppants.
Yeah.
We can use anything. We can use river sand. We can use whatever we have cheaply available. And they have had success. So, and there is a fundamental reason for that, which is beyond the scope of this talk. But definitely we could keep the fractures open. But how to do that is a function of what is the rock made of, what is that we are injecting. It's also a function of the fluid that we are injecting. How does it interact with the rock? Certain fluids, especially like if you have certain clay material, you could cause damage near the face of the fracture by injecting certain fluids. Then after you develop the fracture and you let the fractures close back, you have what we call an effective fracture network, which is what is left out of those fractures open. Now that is what's participating into the flow. That the surface area of that fracture totally is controlling your decline curve. And then with time, that surface area shrinks. Those fractures shrink, and the reason is because we drop the pore pressure and then we have more compaction. We have more stress, keep closing. So that reservoir that we generated, typically during the production time, shrinks. Now with huff and puff, we have the potential to open it back up.
Okay.
As well. That's one of the mechanisms. So going back to why the decline rate is different, it could be any of these things. It could be that the rock type is different. It could be that the number of microfractures that we had in place, maybe the microfractures are cemented with something. Maybe there's bentonite into these fractures naturally, that we are not opening them. And if we do, the opening of those is not as efficient as we do in other rocks. So there could be so many reasons, and that's why characterization and what your group and other groups here are doing is very important to understand why this is happening.
There's so much cool technology associated with this.
Yes.
One other thing you mentioned was nanoparticles. Talk about how those fit into all these different production schemes.
The nanoparticles have been used during this whole process. So if you look at the development of a shale, We start from drilling and then the fracturing jobs, the hydraulic fracturing jobs, and then we start producing from them in primary way. And then we start with the EUR, as we mentioned, or the IUR. The nanoparticles can really play a role wherever there is chemistry. So they could play a role in the drilling fluids to make the drilling fluids more viscous or less viscous, depending on what we need to do. Change the interfacial properties of how the filtrate coming from the mud loss goes to the formation and how it interacts with the fluid that is already existing in the formation. They could carry or interact with surfactants and improve them in a certain way, which those surfactants are used both in the drilling fluid and the fracturing fluid. They could work and interact with the polymers that we are using for fracturing fluid and make them more efficient in the process. During a fracturing fluid, because there's, as you said, there's a lot of technology and knowledge going into this. Like with frac fluids, especially if you're using a cross-linked fluid, a gel, we want to make them a gel, but we want to make them a gel at a certain time. So those nanoparticles could participate into delaying the gelation of the polymers. They could participate into now, after you finish the frac job, you want to get rid of those polymers because you don't want them to block your fractures, correct?
Yeah.
You need to degrade them. So those nanoparticles can delay the breakage of those polymers with time. And they can also be used to change the properties of the near fracture region in the rock and modify the interfacial tension and wettability of the rock to produce more oil.
Thank you for that. So we've covered a lot of different topics related to oil and gas. I want to go high level. Let's take it back a step. So you've spent time here in Wyoming, obviously we're part of a team that did foundational work on the Niobrara. From your perspective, now you're running a tertiary oil recovery program in Kansas. What do you think we should be doing here at the University of Wyoming to really just broadly to support the state and its oil and gas industry?
Well, of course, based on my limited knowledge right now, because I've been gone for a while. But I do see is that actually you're doing the right thing. The SCR is playing a big role in bringing significant amount of government money, which is very crucial. Mm-hmm. And also state funding is, Wyoming is one of the states that I like because the legislators are really supporting the energy industry big time. And that's very important for the legislators to understand the importance of that energy business. And then you have like still URI, who is closer to the industry. Yep. You have interactions with the industry at multiple levels, which is important. And keeping tracking of the new ventures, such as hydrogen, critical minerals. You have, as far as I understand, within SCR, there are multiple groups working on several areas related to these new energy ventures.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And that's really important as well.
Yeah. And you actually are working on it also. So, one of the things that's been really interesting is based on the research that's been done on oil and gas production, there's all these different research offshoots. Mm-hmm. And so one of them that you're working on, that we're also working on, is related to hydrogen. Yep. So what are you doing in that space?
Well, that's natural hydrogen, the area that we are interested in. And the reason for that is...
And I'm not sure everyone realizes, again, natural hydrogen. It just means that it exists in the subsurface. It exists like oil and gas.
It does big time. The only problem is that hydrogen is just so small that it diffuses through a lot of layers and it gets spreaded into different formations. But yes, in Kansas, we have what we call the Mid-Continent Rift. And if you look at some of the original papers in natural hydrogen, they are coming from the Kansas Geological Survey and Geology Department at the University of Kansas, because they did see shows of hydrogen in some of those wells at the time. And then since then, they started to look into different components, to look into the geochemistry of that and how and why this is happening. And we are still working on that. It's at a very early stage with natural hydrogen. We are like in late 1800s with oil. We are still exploring. We don't know a lot about it, but we are figuring it out. But we certainly do know that there are certain mafic and ultramafic rocks that they have the potential to generate hydrogen reacting with water.
Yep. And we, I think, have just recently are part of a program that got funded to look at the same thing. So we're looking at that too.
Yep.
So in another area that's kind of an auxiliary program supporting the oil and gas industry, we have here is the Center for Produced Water Management.
Yep.
That's led by Professor Brandt in Civil and Architectural Engineering and Construction Management. And one area that is of interest, you already mentioned critical minerals. Like, look, what else is in produced water that you might be able to recover that could help offset the costs of treating that produced water?
Yes.
And one thing that we found some of in Wyoming is lithium. And so can you talk about how extracting lithium or other minerals, critical minerals, potentially could help with the challenges around produced water and any technology approaches that you've worked on?
Yes. We recently patented the technology on extracting lithium from bulk brine systems.
Oh, yeah.
And that technology is actually licensed to a company as we are speaking. We just published the first paper at the Energy Transition Symposium in Houston not long ago in August. That system is based on using certain polyelectrolyte-based nanoparticles to extract it just from the bulk system for now, but it has the potential to go to the membranes and go to the high concentration versions of the water as we are going through the treatment process. The produced water studies are very close to my heart because we also had an NSF score around that area that we worked on for a while. Definitely critical minerals are a huge part of what we call energy transition or energy resilience, depending on who you talk to. And as you see, there's a lot of demand for that, and lithium is definitely the top one. Now, produced waters have the potential not just for lithium, but also for other components. The only challenge there is that the concentrations are low, but the volumes are high.
Right.
Now, how to deal with that and how to make the economic limits of the concentration, how to lower it basically in terms of concentration. Right now, I think the target is around 150 ppm, and that's normal. But you really want to make sure that you can capture the smaller concentrations. And that's the challenge, especially with all the stuff we are talking about injecting CO2 under the ground, injecting CO2, injecting geothermal fluids, and with all of these new energy ventures, they could pick up a lot of these critical minerals. But the concentrations may be lower. They may be around 10, 20 ppm. Now, how to come up with technologies that could capture that efficiently and in an economically viable way, that's the challenge of today. And we are doing our share to participate in this, but we are not the only one. There are so many groups around the country who are working on different technologies to do that.
Including us.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The concentrations are a lot lower of these minerals, whether it be lithium or critical minerals, than you would find in like an ore body.
Yep.
But the separation processes could be much more simple.
Yep.
So it's an interesting approach. So we'll be continuing to work on that, and glad you are too. So we have talked about all this different technology and really appreciate your expertise. We've only kind of scratched the surface of these different areas, but really appreciate it. And our last question is not about technology.
Fine.
We always like to ask a question that's more general about our listeners. So you've spent a lot of time in Wyoming and appreciate all you've done for the state. I appreciate you coming back here to Laramie to talk to folks, the community members, faculty, staff, and students here at the university. When you come back, what is your favorite place in Wyoming to visit?
So, believe it or not, Wyoming is my favorite state in the U.S.
Oh.
I actually, since then, I've come here for vacation also. I've come here to do stuff, or not exactly, but if I even come here for business, I always try to do something. Something
extra.
Yes. And when I was here, definitely hiking, fishing, just road trips. And you have so many different interesting places here. Like you go all the way from Yellowstone to Thermopolis in winter. I really like, and you have one of the biggest dinosaur bone digging sites in Thermopolis, which is very cool and interesting. And just even driving in the country, like going to Gillette, I was enjoying it. But generally, the mountains are my favorite part of Wyoming, and just anything in the mountains, from hiking to fishing, whatever we can do, I really enjoy it.
Okay, that's kind of an answer. I'll let you get away with it, though.
I can give you more.
No, it's great. So, well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Barati. I really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing a little bit of your time to do this podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.